Elves were pompous creatures, taught from a young age to feel nothing but utter disgust and hatred towards the other races. For it was the elves who civilized half of Narivor, for it was the elves who built the bridges, sewers, and cities the other races toiled in. Therefore the elves were superior. It seemed, however, that not just pure-blooded elves were taught this delusion, but half-elves as well. Maybe it was something in their blood, maybe it was that everyone around them said so. But Tricurius was convinced that was a view all creatures with a drop of elven blood shared. Tricurius turned his gaze to the downed druid. A group of other druids now stepped up. The eldest of them was also the shortest. He had burning red eyes and a long gray beard. For where the dragon's ear is, its teeth linger nearby. The old man spoke. Fergun got on his feet with a lot of complaining and grunting. He took off his helmet and sheathed his sword. That wasn't an honorable Valhome, old man, he commented. Patricia and Romano shot him a quizzical look, seemingly confused by the proverb. Tricurius, though, knew what he was talking about. Do not speak if you cannot back up your words with violence, and do not call one inferior if you cannot prove your superior. Orcish society revolved around might, battle, and strength, and this was yet another example of that. The proverb itself was allegedly said by Astrain, the Orcish version of Astralish. Doran should have challenged you to a Valhome, although you've proven yourself worthy, human. The elder said, Now let us discuss diplomacy. My name is Eilidi of the Vuvili clan. The elder made a low bow. Patricia and Romano were still completely and utterly confused. There was a good chance they were confused about the Valhome and the clan system. A Valhome was a duel arranged in a secluded place, where friends and family would be invited to watch, as well as a Culligar, a judge to oversee the combat. Valhomes could be arranged for a myriad of reasons, although it was mostly because of the other party making an insult towards the person's family or status. Valhomes could be lethal or non-lethal depending on the severity of the insult or action. It is said the first Valhome was organized by Astrain against the conformity and stability of the universe itself. When he won this Valhome, he declared that change was the emperor of all emperors and fate, as well as the decider of fates. The Orcish clan system also originated from Astrain, although this time it was his defeat that brought them about. Following Astrain's victory against conformity, the blood he had lost became the various gods of the various races we see today. Those gods, however, as they weren't as powerful as Astrain, decided to specialize themselves. Astrain was firmly against this and declared they were trying to embody the same stability, conformity, and contentedness that he had sought to defeat. The gods that created the orcs decided that a few specialized warriors should lead, and that while greatness could be inherited, it should still be proven. However, one that had no legacy of great deeds could accomplish no great deeds themselves. Astrain despised this idea and declared if the gods wouldn't remove it, he would make them remove it. This challenge was accepted by the gods, and with sweat, blood, and tears the gods won over Astrain due to their specialization and their discipline. Now that the ever-fickle Astrain was put in its place, the Orcish gods were free to do as they pleased. And so, they declared that those with a heritage of greatness would form a clan and take control over a tribe, and so they did. Tricurius recounted the story mentally as he thought it might be useful. The best way to defeat your enemy is to know them, after all. His train of thought was cut short by Patricia formulating an actual response. She responded with a low bow. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Eilidi, although I do advise you to not use violence on ULE territory. She warned him sternly. It seemed like Eilidi heeded the warning, though, as he immediately nodded his head. Of course. You won the Valhome. If anything, You asking us such a minor favor is a sign of your forgiveness, he said. Patricia looked pleased with that answer. Excellent. I suppose I should introduce myself. I am Patricia Williams, ambassador of the ULE to UDA1, also known as Narivore. She continued, Before we continue, I will be needing you to read and agree to the following contract. She gestured to Carlson, who gave her a few sheets of paper. She proceeded to hand them to the various emissaries. The druids instantly began reading. The contracts were in Elvish, and Carlson barely had time to get them, as when the orcs were spotted, he immediately writing them. Or that was at least what Tricurius assumed. The half-naked tattooed man, however, seemed to have a lot more difficulty. And Fergoon was still recovering from being thrown against what seemed like an iron wall, although Tricurius very much doubted he could read anyway. The tattooed man asked for one of his companions, who did seem to be capable of reading Elvish. The man translated the document, and the tattooed man nodded. Me agree, he said after the translator of the document, in very dumbed-down and badly pronounced Elvish. Fergoon asked one of the druids for help. Before the druid helped, however, he first took the time to explain why this was the reason druids were so important and deserved more influence. After which, he translated the document for Fergoon, who gave his verbal consent a moment later. It took more than an hour for the entire Orcish entourage to give their written or verbal consent, after which Carlson gave them a map of the castle and gave them watches, as well as a time to meet Patricia and the day and hour of the negotiations. After the meeting, Tricurius went to his quarters to pick up the Orcish dictionary and then proceeded to deliver it to Carlson, who thanked him for his contribution and hastily ran off with it. Maybe his cooperation would earn him a favor. It should, in his opinion. Shortly after he went to the cafeteria and picked up a cup of tea, there he also met several orcs, who were seemingly pestering the human cooks. He decided to listen to their conversation. Raw meat, that's what we need, not your pitiful censored version, one of the orcs yelled at the cook. I can just smell that you poured something over this fine piece of meat. He yelled again. The human looked tired, disappointed, and yet not intimidated. Sir, I'm going to need to ask you. The cook was cut short by another orc marching up to him. He seemed to flex his chest muscles and make himself intentionally bigger. The human was still unimpressed. He then raised his fist and flexed his arm. You want this in your face? He asked as he pointed towards his fist. Last warning, stop pestering me or I'll call the guards. The cook said, and I'm sure you don't want to end up like your comrade. He was most likely referencing Doran. The orc let out a rumbling laughter and bared his sharp, tusk-like teeth in anticipation. I'd gladly fight your pitiful idiots, they need armor, I don't. He balled his fists and prepared to hit the human behind the counter, who simply took a step back. For a moment, Tricurius considered not intervening. But why shouldn't he? It had dawned on him that these humans were most likely the closest thing to what the Imperium would consider perfection, and yet they followed completely different ethics and ideas to get there. It was that moment he realized that the Imperium wasn't just imperfect. It wasn't just outclassed militarily, economically, and technologically. It was also outclassed morally. Tricurius had been reevaluating his youth and education for a few days now, and, while it was hard to accept, he had been taught falsehood after falsehood. And why would elven morality, which said that as the powerful define morality, morality is power, be anything but another falsehood? Again, it was full of contradictions. When elven children were mistreated at the hands of dwarves, the dwarves were wrong. That didn't make sense. The dwarves defined morality as they were the most powerful in that situation, and yet the Imperium cast the dwarves as evil and impure. Frankly, Tricurius didn't really know what morality was if it wasn't power, but he knew one thing. that either the idea that morality is power is so flawed it cannot be followed without being evil, or the much more reasonable alternative, that morality wasn't power. For now, he set up a quite rudimentary and simple foundation of morality. That any action or person who intentionally inflicts harm on another person is less moral than one who causes pleasure or kindness. The orcs were maybe the most powerful in this situation, and yet he felt a moral duty, an obligation to stand up and defend the cook, even if he could simply call the guards, which he would do anyway. Following his line of thinking, the orcs were trying to inflict harm upon somebody without a proper reason for doing so. As such, they were clearly in the wrong. With one decisive motion, Tricurius stood up. "Halt!" he bellowed to the orcs, pestering the cook. The orcs turned their heads to Tricurius, whose resolve was still strong. If things got really violent, he could always conjure a fireball. He reminded himself of that fact. "Well, little elf, are you going to try and defend your fellow civilized highfalutin?" The biggest one yelled out to him. "Violence isn't preferable, although if you start a fight, I'll end it." Tricurius replied as he conjured up a fireball in his right hand. The cook seemed to quickly contact the guards by tapping on the iron stud in his ears. Within a few seconds, Tricurius heard the thundering sound of several iron-clad men entering the room. Upon hearing them, Tricurius doused his fireball. "Sion! Seor!" The guard bellowed out in what sounded like Orcish. It seems like they actually did something useful with his dictionary. The largest orc's grin slowly faded away as he realized that he messed up. He was currently surrounded by over 5 guards, and Tricurius himself, who, if necessary, could easily fry the orc. "Karth leorg, mach mein gear, attain mein turgi diogotos," the orc yelled back. "Nach, laida ul e tuarmeeg dur," the guard yelled back at him. The orc simply let out an annoyed grunt and stormed out of the room. Tricurius let out a sigh of relief and sat down once more. The guards came running up to him a few seconds later. He felt their heavy armor shake the ground as they walked. Their helmets reflected the light of the magical torches within the cafeteria, and yet the heavy armor did not weigh them down. On the contrary, it only seemed to make them faster and stronger. "Ambassador Tricurius," the armored guard said, "would you please explain what happened here?" he said. His helmet made it sound monotone, yet firm. The ambassador nodded. "But of course," he responded. He stroked his chin in thought. "I decided to dine alone for once, when the orcs also entered." He inspected the guard and then raised his hands. "Not that I have a problem with orcs, but their culture is strange." The armored guard nodded and turned his head to the cook. "Does he speak true?" he then asked. The cook made an affirming gesture. "Yes, he does," he said, "although I don't know what the ambassador means with that they've a strange culture." He added, "Both the Emoni and the orcs have something called the Vialiv in Orcish or Vuan in Emoni." Tricurius clarified, "It's a set of rules which dictates what a person should eat and how they should eat it." "What does that have to do with this?" the guard asked. "Perhaps it's their bodies, their culture, or their gods, but the Emoni and orcs are capable of meat without cooking it first. Barbaric, I know." Tricurius couldn't help but add that last little comment. The cook now spoke up. "And let me guess, eating cooked meat is sacrilegious, or something?" he asked. Tricurius nodded. To quote it, "Swear upon thine swords and spears, sons of the raven, and, or crow, depending if you follow the Emoni or Orcish saga, that thou shalt eat only what thine hath hunted, and that thou shalt not desecrate just like thou would not desecrate the corpse of thine deceased quite gruesome, if I do say so myself." "Right. So I assume you offered the orc a piece of cooked meat?" the guard asked. The cook confirmed that with a nod, Yes. If I'd known, I would've. The guard raised his hand. You would have given them raw meat. He sighed. Right, Kruger. Achabe, stay here. I and De Leon will talk to the orcs. Yes, Sergeant, the others responded in unison. Two of the soldiers walked away, while the two others went to guard the front of the cafeteria. Tricurius allowed himself to relax and took a sip of his tea. He looked at his watch, 16:34. He'd probably leave at 5, and then have some time left to write reports and relax a bit before having dinner with his entourage. He took another sip of his tea, and a thought seeped into his mind. Which gods did the humans worship? For everything he knew about humanity, he knew so very little about their culture, religion, and history. If he had to form a cohesive conclusion from all the information he currently possessed, he'd say they were materialistic, and yet generous, knowledgeable, although unwise. He took another sip of his tea. He looked inside the cup. He drank it all up. Maybe he should gather more information about humans and their culture, but who to ask? He scratched his chin. He could simply ask Carlson. But why would he need more knowledge about them? They'd think he was trying to spy on them. He could pretend like it was to prevent diplomatic incidents, which was partially true. He stood up and took his cup with him. He put down the cup on the counter, where the cook was cleaning something, and walked towards the exit of the room. There he started his grand adventure to find Carlson. First he asked one of the guards outside of the cafeteria. They said they'd ring him, and that he should wait there for a few minutes. Tricurius took those precious minutes to ask the guards what he meant with ringing him, and although the guard wore a helmet, you could see his facial expression turned into one of exhaustion. Imagine you can talk to someone via a little device. If you ring someone, you're calling him via that device, speaking through that device to him. It reminded Tricurius of the Virillian speech, a spell which allowed you to use Ternitia to transfer your voice directly into someone's ear. It was thought up by Palexios Virillian. It was notoriously difficult to perform, however. As such devices common? Tricurius asked. The guard nodded. Yeah, they are. He paused for a moment. Practically everyone has them, although many of the devices with that function also serve multiple other purposes, he added. Interesting. To be able to record sounds like one can record letters must have many practical applications. Tricurius's mind raced through the various things you could do with such miraculous technology. Great scholars could record their words for all to hear. Information could be easily spread. That would explain the extraordinarily high level of education most humans seem to possess. I'd imagine such a thing would have many applications, Tricurius said. Before the conversation could progress any further, Carlson walked in. Inspecting his appearance, Tricurius noted black bags beneath his eyes and a rather tiresome look. Tricurius smiled. Greetings, Lieutenant, he said. Carlson tried to smile, but failed so miserably even an emotionally incompetent orc could see it. Greetings, Ambassador, he said with a meek voice. The man was doing worse than he had ever seen ever human do. Are you all right, Lieutenant? Tricurius asked. The lieutenant sighed. My job requires me to answer yes. He said, Enough pleasantries, though, he added. Tricurius nodded. Of course, apologies for bothering you, but I believe this request is quite urgent. He said, I wish to inquire about your culture, philosophy, and history, so that I might avoid diplomatic accidents like those that happened and will happen with the orcs, if that isn't too much of a problem. When he was finished pronouncing that last word, Carlson's face transformed from a rather sorrowful and tiresome expression to one much more energetic, although still far from happy. That isn't a problem in the slightest, on the contrary. It saves me a lot of time and energy. He raised his hand to his chin. Tell me, what do you want to know? That was a good question. What interested him most? He could start with their history, And although that would help a lot with explaining human cultural norms, religion, and philosophy, it most likely wouldn't help answer his question of what morality was, or who he was, or what was right and wrong in this world. Religion, although an incredibly important and often underestimated variable in diplomatic discussions, seemed to be largely irrelevant in human society. They did not pray to their gods, nor did he see humans arguing about them. Sometimes they referred to a god, so it was safe to assume if humans even worshipped gods at all, most of them were monotheistic. On the other hand, the Voron, although polytheistic, also cursed with the name of Astralike, and only Astralike. Making the assumption that the humans were monotheistic could be a grave error. Then, there was philosophy. What did the humans think? Not just of other things, but of themselves. Did they follow dwarven ethics and morals which decreed that there was no virtue but to be absolute in one's values? Or did they follow Questiar's idea that absolutism in and of itself wasn't a virtue, but absolutism of virtue was? And that virtue was simply dependent on who defined it, and as the gods, specifically the elven ones, were the most powerful, they defined what sin and virtue was, what to choose, what to pick. He was like a child with his parents at a market. Should he get the wooden castle or the dull sword? Should he pick religion or philosophy or maybe history? What about their culture and music? Those were also quite tempting options. What about literature and their scholars? All of it. That was Tricurius' answer to that seemingly impossible question.